Every morning begins the same. I rise before the sun, slip into a black robe that smells faintly of starch and old oak, and drive through silent streets to the courthouse downtown. The city is still groggy when I enter my chambers, greeted by the quiet click of my shoes on marble. My office smells like leather and law books, the air thick with the kind of seriousness people expect from a federal judge. From this bench, I've sentenced cartel leaders, ruled on billion-dollar lawsuits, and presided over cases that made national news. In this room, my words carry weight. No one interrupts me. No one questions whether I belong here. Yet, as soon as I leave the courtroom, the world forgets all of that. At home, I'm just a parent trying to protect a child who cannot protect herself. My daughter was born with a rare neurological condition that left her nonverbal and physically disabled. She uses a wheelchair to get around and communicates through a series of sounds, gestures, and the expressions that only a parent can understand. She is joy in motion-bright eyes, soft hands, sudden laughter, but the world often sees her as something broken. I thought moving into this new neighborhood would give us both peace, a quieter life, a better school district, fewer stairs. What I didn't expect was that the greatest threat to that peace would come not from the streets or the courtroom, but from the woman across the cul-de-sac. Our moving day was chaotic in the way that all moving days are. Boxes stacked high, furniture wrapped in plastic, movers sweating through their uniforms under the heavy sun. My daughter sat in the shade of the front porch, tucked safely in her wheelchair, watching the activity with wide eyes and a quiet smile. She had been excited about the move in her own way, clapping her hands when we first showed her the new house, squealing softly when she saw her new room painted in soft lavender. In the middle of it all, as we were trying to unload the kitchen boxes, I heard a sharp, high-pitched cry from the porch. I turned quickly and saw her gripping the side of her wheelchair, distressed. She had dropped her favorite spoon, the one with the smooth rubber handle she liked to chew on. It had fallen between the wooden slats of the porch, and she couldn't reach it. That tiny loss, in her world, was massive. Her voice rose in volume and frustration, echoing briefly across the street. I knelt beside her to calm her down, murmuring the soothing phrases she knew, stroking her arm until her breathing slowed. When I looked up, a woman in yoga pants and oversized sunglasses stood a few feet away, holding a potted plant and staring at us like we had disrupted her afternoon peace. She didn't speak, only narrowed her eyes and walked briskly back to her house. At the time, I thought little of it. Maybe she was just curious, maybe she was surprised by the sudden scream. But as the days passed, it became clear that she hadn't been startled. She had been assessing us, weighing our presence against whatever rigid ideas of normalcy she carried with her. And we had already failed. It began with a note, a single sheet of printer paper folded in half and tucked neatly beneath the welcome mat. There was no greeting, no signature, only a typed message in bold font that read, "Some residents are sensitive to noise. Please be considerate." I read it twice, then looked around the porch as if the sender might be watching from behind a curtain. I knew exactly who had written it. There was only one neighbor who had stared at my daughter like a problem waiting to happen. A few days later, I met her officially. She introduced herself as Karen Whitmore, head of the HOA's compliance committee. She had a clipboard in one hand and a tight smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. She welcomed us to the neighborhood with the warmth of a traffic citation. Her eyes flicked past me to my daughter, who was playing quietly with a ribbon tied to her wrist, and Karen's smile faltered for a moment before she refocused. She pointed out the trash bin placement, mentioned the mailbox needed repainting, and warned us that the HOA took aesthetics very seriously. I nodded politely, thanked her for stopping by, and watched her walk away without acknowledging my daughter at all. From that point on, the notes came regularly. One about the wheelchair ramp being unsightly, another complaining about wailing noises at all hours, even though my daughter's vocalizations were no louder than a distant radio. There were reminders about lawn care, porch decor, holiday lights that hadn't even gone up yet. Each message was clipped in tone, perfectly worded to avoid outright hostility while brimming with condescension. She never knocked, never called, never addressed anything in person. She chose to act like a bureaucrat guarding the gates of a gated community that didn't even have a gate. I kept every note, filed them in a folder along with time stamps and photos, and a growing list of violations that seemed crafted just for us. Karen wasn't just an overzealous neighbor. She was a storm gathering at the edge of our peace, and she believed the rules were hers to enforce and ours to obey. It was never loud, never overt. That was the thing about people like Karen. They didn't yell or curse or threaten, not where anyone else could hear. They used the quiet instruments of pressure, the petty rituals of control, the steady rhythm of disapproval that wears you down without ever saying your name. One morning I stepped outside to find my daughter's wheelchair had been turned slightly off the porch mat, its wheels sunk into the damp lawn. She couldn't have moved it on her own, and I hadn't left it that way. There was no note that time, just a vague sense of intrusion, the feeling that someone had crossed into our space while we slept. The next week, I caught Karen standing across the street with her phone pointed in our direction. She didn't flinch when she saw me. She just lowered the phone, turned away, and disappeared into her house. A few days later, an email from the HOA arrived, complaining that children with behavioral issues should be supervised more closely. My daughter had been on the porch with me the entire afternoon. Nothing had happened, but the message was clear. They were watching, and they were crafting a narrative. During an HOA meeting, which I attended quietly and without speaking, Karen made a point of reading aloud a list of nuisance behaviors. She didn't mention us by name, but when she said excessive vocalizations, property clutter, and mobility obstructions, her eyes flicked toward me, then quickly away. A few other board members glanced in my direction. No one said anything. I could have spoken then. I could have used my voice, my title, the authority that followed me everywhere else. But I didn't. Not yet. Instead, I took notes. I listened. I let her talk, let her build her case out of half-truths and whispered complaints, because people like Karen always believe they are the heroes of their own stories. They never imagine that the person sitting quietly across from them might be waiting for the moment they'll need to answer for every word. The first real confrontation happened on a Saturday morning. I was on the front steps, tightening a loose bolt on the railing while my daughter played with a wind chime she had taken from the back patio. The sky was clean and blue, and for a moment, the house felt like a home again. Then Karen appeared at the edge of her driveway, arms crossed, lips pursed like she had been holding back a grievance for days. She walked over slowly, each step deliberate, and stopped at the edge of our lawn without greeting. She looked at the ramp we had installed last week, the one that curved down from the porch to the walkway. It was modest, made of composite wood that matched the trim of the house, and approved by the city for accessibility. Karen pointed to it like it was graffiti. That ramp, she said, was not submitted for architectural review. You're required to go through the HOA's compliance channel before making structural changes. I stood, dusted off my hands, and told her that the ramp was required under the Americans with Disabilities Act. She shook her head before I finished, already preparing a rebuttal. This isn't a public building, she said. This is a residential community. We have standards. If everyone started installing things without permission, the neighborhood would go to ruin. I asked her, plainly, if she understood that my daughter needed the ramp to enter her own home. Her response was chilling in its calm. Then maybe this isn't the right place for her. The words hung there for a second too long. Not the right place. As if she were talking about an unwanted piece of furniture, or a barking dog. I didn't respond. I walked inside, closed the door behind me, and sat down beside my daughter, who had no idea that someone had just tried to erase her existence with a smile. That afternoon, another HOA letter arrived. This one listed unauthorized construction and persistent noise disturbances as potential grounds for violation review. The implication was clear. Karen wasn't going to stop with complaints. She was preparing for something bigger, something legal. She wanted to turn our presence into a problem the system could solve on her behalf. It was early evening when it happened, the kind of still hour where the light softens and the day starts to exhale. I was in the kitchen chopping vegetables when I heard the sound. Not the usual chirps and giggles from my daughter, but a sharp, panicked scream. I ran to the front yard and saw her near the sidewalk, her arms flailing, her face twisted in frustration. A bee had landed on her tray table. She hated insects. She couldn't speak, but her fear came out in shrieks and wild movement. I rushed to her, brushed the bee away, and knelt beside her wheelchair to soothe her. She started calming down as I murmured to her, her fingers twitching as she gripped the edges of her blanket. It wasn't unusual for her to get overwhelmed. What was unusual was the arrival of 2 squad cars pulling up to the curb. The officers stepped out cautiously, hands resting near their weapons. One had his other hand on the clasp of his holster. The other scanned the yard like he was preparing to find something dangerous. They called out to me, asking if everything was all right. Voices tense and clipped. I stood slowly, raising my hands halfway in an instinct I hadn't needed in years. They said a neighbor had reported a violent individual, screaming and flailing near children. I turned to look and saw Karen standing on her porch with her arms crossed, watching. She didn't flinch when our eyes met. I explained the situation, as calmly as I could. My daughter had a sensory episode. She was safe. She was not a threat to anyone. One officer walked closer, saw her sitting quietly now, stroking the ribbon on her wrist. He relaxed. The other one muttered something into his radio. They left without further incident, but not before offering a patronizing reminder to keep things under control next time. My daughter smiled at them as they left, unaware she had been mistaken for something dangerous. I didn't sleep that night. I kept seeing those flashing lights, kept hearing the way the word violent had been said over the radio. Karen had escalated. And now, I knew, she was willing to weaponize anything to get what she wanted. The summons came in a plain envelope, with the HOA letterhead printed in stiff blue ink. It was addressed to me as a resident, not as a judge, and cited sections of the association bylaws I had never seen before. According to the complaint, we were being brought before the court for repeated violations of community regulations, including unauthorized modifications to the property, ongoing noise disturbances, and creating what they described as an unsafe and unfit environment for neighboring families. I read it twice, then a third time, waiting for it to make sense. My daughter's existence, her presence on a quiet street in a safe home, was now considered a legal threat. There were no allegations of harm, no claims of property damage or disorderly conduct. Just the same vague complaints dressed up in legal language. She made noise. She needed a ramp. She had episodes that unsettled people who never took the time to understand her. Karen had gone beyond letters and phone calls. She had pulled the levers of the HOA with enough pressure to turn personal prejudice into official action. The board approved the motion. The complaint was filed. A court date was set in federal district court due to the ADA implications. It was a decision likely meant to intimidate, not realizing where the case would ultimately land. I could feel the irony tightening around the edges. They didn't know who I was. They hadn't connected my home address to the courtroom where I sat in judgment 5 days a week. To them, I was just another resident, another problem to handle. Their filing included a list of demands. The ramp needed to be removed. We would be fined for non-compliance. They requested a court order barring non-conforming individuals from using communal areas. At the bottom of the list was a final, chilling note. The HOA reserves the right to seek permanent removal if compliance is not met. They couldn't say what they meant outright. They couldn't write down that they didn't want a disabled child in their neighborhood. But the intent was plain, buried in euphemisms and legal phrases. Karen had used every tool at her disposal. Now she was taking it to the one place she never should have. The courtroom was small and spare, designed for routine hearings and civil disputes, not spectacle. Karen arrived in a tailored blazer, 2 shades too bright for the setting, and sat confidently at the plaintiff's table beside a lawyer who looked like he had just graduated from charm school. She carried a folder thick with printed emails, grainy photos, and complaint forms, all arranged like trophies from a campaign she was certain she would win. She didn't recognize me. I was seated quietly near the back, waiting for the administrative check-in to finish. Another judge had been assigned the case, as protocol required, but I had petitioned to observe the proceedings, not as a defendant, not even as a judge, just as a parent with a vested interest in what came next. Karen spoke first. Her lawyer did most of the talking, but she kept interrupting him with whispered corrections and emphatic nods. They laid out their claims with practiced detachment. My daughter's vocalizations were reframed as outbursts. Her wheelchair ramp was a violation of aesthetics. Her presence, according to Karen, was destabilizing to the community atmosphere. The lawyer read from prepared remarks and concluded by saying, with no trace of irony, that their goal was simply to maintain peace and order. Then Karen stood and asked to speak directly. She said that my daughter frightened children, disrupted sleep schedules, and caused her significant emotional stress. She said that the situation had gone far beyond reason, and that exceptional circumstances call for exceptional remedies. When pressed to explain, she added, "Some people just don't belong in certain communities. At a certain point, the only just solution is removal, permanent removal." And then she paused, tilted her head slightly, and said the words I would remember for a long time after. If this were another time, another place, this kind of disruption would merit the death penalty. The room went silent. Even her lawyer froze. She looked proud of herself, unaware that the judge had just stopped writing and was staring at her in disbelief. Karen believed she had won the room. What she had actually done was expose herself completely. The door at the side of the courtroom opened, and the bailiff called the room to order. All rose. Karen stood as well, smoothing the hem of her blazer and turning toward the bench, waiting to see which judge had been assigned to oversee the proceedings. I stepped forward and took my place behind the bench. She didn't recognize me at first. Her eyes skimmed over me without pause, the way someone might glance at a stranger on the street. I adjusted the microphone and looked over the docket, letting the silence linger just a little longer. I could feel her watching now, the way someone watches a puzzle start to solve itself in front of them. Her lips parted slightly. She tilted her head. Then I saw it, the flicker of disbelief, then confusion, and finally fear. "Good morning," I said. "I am Judge Thompson, and I will be observing today's proceedings in an official supervisory capacity. Due to the potential implications related to federal accessibility laws, this case has been elevated beyond the HOA's civil complaint process and is under judicial review. Let the record show that I have recused myself from final ruling due to personal involvement, but I will be present for the full duration of testimony and evidence." Karen's lawyer tried to recover first. He stood abruptly, stumbling through an objection about bias and propriety. I let him speak, then calmly reminded him that all procedural requirements had been met. I had recused myself. A separate judge would issue the final decision. But the look on Karen's face told the real story. She had come to court expecting to confront a nameless authority, someone she could charm or bully or manipulate. She had not imagined that the person she had spent months targeting, the person she had threatened, photographed, and reported, would be the one sitting above her, listening to every word. I leaned forward, still within the bounds of professionalism, and asked one question. "Mrs. Whitmore, can you clarify your statement earlier regarding a so-called death penalty for a disabled child?" Her lawyer tried to object again, but I pressed. Karen opened her mouth, closed it, and looked around the courtroom like someone searching for an exit that wasn't there. "Let the record reflect," I continued, "that the plaintiff has advocated for the forced removal and, in her words, permanent elimination of a minor with a documented disability, in a setting where that child is lawfully protected under federal statute." I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. The weight of the law was already settling over the room like fog. Karen said nothing more after that. Her certainty had vanished. In its place was a quiet, flickering panic, the kind of silence that follows a scream no one else joins. When the presiding judge entered, the room shifted. He was calm, middle-aged, with reading glasses perched low on his nose, and a voice that held a steady rhythm, like someone used to listening far more than speaking. He greeted the courtroom with formality and nodded to me before taking his seat. Karen watched him with something close to hope, still trying to rebuild whatever composure she had left. He began with the facts. He read the HOA complaint aloud, line by line, pausing occasionally to clarify language that had been intentionally vague. When he reached the phrase, non-conforming individuals, he looked up and asked Karen's lawyer to define it. The man hesitated, then muttered something about community standards and behavioral unpredictability. The judge pressed him again. "Are you referring to a child with a disability?" The lawyer swallowed and said yes. Then the judge turned to the defense counsel, a civil rights attorney who had taken the case pro bono after hearing what had been said in the initial filing. She spoke carefully, without theatrics, presenting the ramp approval documents, recordings of HOA meetings, printed copies of the anonymous complaints, and witness statements from 2 neighbors who had quietly offered support after the police incident. But the turning point came when the judge asked to hear the security footage. A camera facing our front yard had captured everything: the porch, the ramp, The afternoon my daughter screamed, the arrival of police, and Karen standing calmly with her phone in hand. When the judge saw the child at the center of it all, my daughter, hands fluttering, face open and unguarded, removed his glasses and sighed. He addressed Karen directly. "I see no evidence of violation here. What I see is an abuse of legal process used to harass a child with a federally protected condition. I see a misuse of authority by an HOA acting under the direction of one individual for personal grievances. This court will not be used to sanitize cruelty behind the language of order and decorum." Karen's lawyer tried to argue again, but the judge raised a hand. "This is not a debate. It is a ruling. The complaint is dismissed with prejudice. Further, the plaintiff and the HOA board are now subject to an investigation into potential civil rights violations. Fines may follow. Sanctions are pending." There was a long pause. No applause, no outburst. Just the stillness that comes after a weight has been lifted. Karen didn't look at me as she left. Her shoulders were stiff, her eyes fixed forward, as if willing herself to vanish before anyone else could see her unravel. She had walked into court expecting to win. She left with a lesson about power and where it truly resides. Karen moved out of the neighborhood 3 months later. The house went up for sale quietly. No open house, no farewell gathering. Just a moving truck one morning, boxes loaded in silence, and a for sale sign that stayed crooked until someone finally came to take it down. No one said much about her after she left. A few neighbors nodded more kindly at us in the weeks that followed. One of them brought over a plate of cookies and muttered something about being sorry it had gone so far. I thanked her, though the words felt like too little, too late. The HOA restructured its board. New members were voted in, some of them people who had avoided Karen during her reign but now stepped forward. The new president asked if I would consult on revising the community bylaws to better align with accessibility standards. I declined. I didn't need to fix their system. I had done what I came to do. At home, everything returned to its rhythm. My daughter still spun her ribbon on the porch and hummed to herself when the wind picked up. She still had her episodes. They still rattled the air and sometimes drew stares from passing joggers, but there was no longer the sense of being hunted. She was free to be exactly who she was, in her own home, on her own terms. There were nights I sat in the living room and played it all back in my head. Karen's face when she realized who I was, the silence in the courtroom after the ruling, the way cruelty can dress itself in rules and policies, hoping no one will look too closely. I had spent my career in rooms where justice was a tool, a symbol, a goal, but this had been personal. This had been about my child. She will never know the full story. She will never understand how close someone came to making her feel like a burden. And that, I think, is the greatest victory. She remains untouched by the worst of it. Still smiling, still herself. And I remain what I've always been, her mother, her shield, and when necessary, her judge. People often ask me how I stay composed in the courtroom. They assume it comes from years of practice, from the weight of the robe or the echo of a gavel. But the truth is simpler than that. I learned patience from watching my daughter sit in the middle of a world that rarely tries to understand her. I learned endurance from the way she faces each day, each sound, each unfamiliar touch, without giving up. She is my anchor, my lesson, and my reminder that dignity does not need to be loud to be powerful. What happened in that neighborhood was not unique. People like Karen exist in every community. They speak in rules and policies, but their words are shaped by fear, by ignorance, by the desire to control what they do not understand. They mistake silence for weakness. They see difference and feel discomfort. And when that discomfort grows, it turns to cruelty masked as order. But my daughter is not weak. She is not fragile. And she is not alone. That courtroom was never about revenge. It was about truth. It was about holding a mirror up to someone who had never been forced to look at herself clearly. And it was about reminding everyone watching that the law protects those who cannot always protect themselves. My daughter may never speak a single word, but in her stillness, in her laughter, in her quiet resilience, she told the world exactly who she is, and I made sure it listened.